Great. Hi, welcome back. This is the fourth video on climate racism. You made it to the final video. Great. Welcome. We are going to dive into media and climate racism, with which I mean how racism shows up in the way climate and climate activism is framed and platformed, and which messengers are heard or celebrated and which are erased or marginalized. So often the starting point for learning about this is from well-meaning people who want to be more inclusive. But I want to give a little note how I personally feel about inclusivity is that it's putting the burden of assimilation on marginalized and oppressed people. So what do I mean by that? I mean inclusion. In inclusion, there is a power dynamics between the includer and the includee. They're not the same. It's, to say it a bit crude, it's like the fucker and the fucked. It's crude, but it paints a picture of who's in control and who's expected to take it. Just take it. Take a seat at a table instead of choosing the table, the arrangements, maybe saying, hey, I don't want to be at the table. I want to be just a circle on the ground where we can first and foremost reconnect with the land base. So within inclusion in this climate movement and telling the story and wanting to connect, I think it's important to first recognize that inclusivity in and of itself is not the answer, and then investigate how dominant and marginal narratives coexist and how they're both equally subjective. So kind of investigate the whiteness of the dominant narrative. So on this slide, I put some pictures together that exemplify whitewashed environmentalism. I know there are plenty of white people with a strong political identity that would not reproduce these whitewashed environmentalist pictures. So I'm not referring to your political identity here as a white person. It's less about skin color than it is about positionality of whiteness. So what do these t-shirts express? Well, we see Save the Planet, the only one with chocolate, which is, of course, utter privilege and materialist, only thinking of the goodies. But we also see more subtle things like ride a bike and go vegan, which may sound helpful, but it's also really fencing environmental concerns in a consumer lifestyle choices frame or narrative. And it kind of generates feel-good solutions overall. We also see God doesn't create planet B for us, which is kind of displacing nature's creation and regeneration itself by Christianity. And overall, we see a lot of saviorism and save the future. The future, I mean, this is used by many people, also people of color, but I find it an abstract temporal concept within a linear developmental way of thinking. What do I mean by that? It's kind of this idea that things are supposed to get better, and we're not really pausing to grieve or be angry about all the injustice of history, of the history that is present in this very current moment. So the millions of murdered people, species gone extinct, 100 million people died in colonization in the Americas, and there is a sense of alienation from this loss, so it can stay comfortable. So we look at the other narrative, and this is just a other narrative. There are many. The idea of looking at different sides is actually seeing that there's pluriversalism, plural ideas of our existence and coexistence here on Earth. But this is a slice more from an indigenous resistance language. And we get a sense of collective well-being. We see examples from the Zapatista rebellion, everything for everyone and nothing for ourselves. Another thing we see is songs, language, ceremony, natural law, all the things that were forbidden by colonialism, all the things that can heal or weave people into a sense of kinship with environment, human and non-human. Warrior, say the leggings, an understanding that asymmetrical struggle demands a fight, a resistance, that oppression is not a misunderstanding we can get out of by personal wokeness, but requires dismantling of a structure of that oppression. So if we look at these very different frames for environmental action, which one is more predominant here in the Netherlands? Let's take a look at the Duurzame Top 100 list, each year published by Trouw. And again, this is not what some climate activists might think or feel reflect their own endeavors, but this is what is platformed in media, what is platformed in society most. So this is a really good example of media climate racism. We see here 100 people. So what do you first notice about this list, who are supposed to be our biggest hope for environmental solutions in the Netherlands? Right. So one thing I notice is that it takes a long time before I see a person of color. You do find one. Look closely at 69. Another thing is that I'm missing activists, people who actually wage resistance. There again, there's the exception, but overall what we see is corporate or entrepreneurial business folks. And highlighted here for you to see clearly, there is Unilever, the chairman of some sort of board, Paul Polman. What does it say? What does it signal to society that in the Duurzame Top 100, the sustainable top 100, it is reproducing white innocence, washing away the mass murder, theft, and ecocide, not only in Africa and Asia, which we explored in our first video, but also in Malaysia and Indonesia predominantly today, wiping away forest and still in the palm oil business, still making profits on other people's lands. So in this slide, I wanted to celebrate some of the environmental activists and change makers of colors that we have in the Netherlands. And while institutions pretend we are simply not here, I want to, make it visible that we are here. If we are not here visibly, we are most likely not respectable enough because we value our anti-oppression environmentalism more than entrepreneurial blah blah. So the story of erasure of Indigenous and Black and Brown and Red people happens all the time, both in the Green movement and in the media. This is a famous example you might know of Vanessa Nakate, who was cropped out of the picture in a news article, so only the 4 white girls were visible in the media. I know from a friend who used to work at a newspaper that it was forbidden to put a person of color on the front page. It would diminish the sales. Journalists are taught to abide or internalize such shitty marketing thinking. Um, Another example is this Insta post from an Indigenous woman. Did anyone consider the optics of a white climate activist traveling from Europe on a boat to Indigenous lands to spread a message we've been saying for 500 years? This feels like the environmental Mayflower taking resources, space, in a movement that we're still criminalized for. Note here, she doesn't critique Greta, but the showcasing and the platforming and the privilege around it, that while 3 Earth defenders a week get murdered worldwide, for years and years on end, reports have been showing this. And these are mostly Indigenous and small farmers of color defending their lands from imperial corporations, mining, fossil fuels, agribusiness, and mega dams. That a white girl can come over on a boat, which is ironic historically, to enlighten. Also note that Native Americans are killed in police encounters at a higher rate than any other racial or ethnic group, according to data centers from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Yet they rarely do these deaths gain national spotlight. I think this is important also to note with Black Lives Matter, which is amazing at fighting back on white supremacy and police violence. That there's a whole longer history, both in education and in media, that erases the death of Indigenous people, like they're never even here. And I think that has to do with the fact that if they're not there, you don't have to deal with their land rights. So yeah, the idea that the US needs a cute white girl to enlighten them when they kill Indigenous Earth defenders on the land they stole is infuriating. So what can we see about the patterns that emerge around platforming? If we inspect the platforming and privileging of storytellers, we see that white voices, kid voices, and researchers, like scientists, gain respectability and offer a point of entry for white masses to follow the learning curve. There is, however, a structural lack of solidarity and loyalty to supporting Indigenous leadership, which we've also seen in the political realm. So I want to say once again, this is not a critique to Greta, who often steps aside to give the space for Indigenous youth, and not a critique of Naomi Klein, who has written amazing books that are all on my shelf. And on the left, we see Severin Suzuki, who spoke to the UN in the 90s, who was the Greta of the 90s. Also kind of seeing that this is, you know, it's not the first time, and still politics will not get it. So it prefers, yeah, people to talk from a place of innocence. Now comes the moment to reflect. How does storytelling of white privilege show up in your own activism? So I'll discuss 3 examples to reflect on. So one, Extinction Rebellion Netherlands, an example of being funny and giving thanks to the Amsterdam police for flying climate neutral. Yes, funny engages on social media, but funny for who? It surely is alienating or alienated from the decades of long struggle, marginalized struggle to abolish police and as institution of oppression. That we now see that is taking mass momentum to defund the police and really see that the police was there from the beginning to oppress former slaves, to enslave people, to do more around crowd control than crime control. There's some interesting articles on that as well that I will share. So giving thanks to police is really something that would trigger a lot of people of color, Many people of color would never, ever call the police, not after being raped, not after being mugged, or for any reason whatsoever, because it would simply multiply the trauma on top of trauma. Another example to examine is the CNN. And this has come across in different media, so it's not really CNN, but any big media that kind of frames this 12 years to stop climate catastrophe or 11 years to stop. Not only is it wrong to think that there is time left, as we've already hit 1.5 degree warming on the land base. Yes, it's only 1.1 warming average over the land and water put together, but yeah, we just all critical science that we've seen already in 2009 at the climate summit shows that between 2010 and 2020 was decade zero to radically decrease the emissions. Also thinking that pollution of today has a lag time of 40 years in showing up in climate change. So I'm not a big fan of the scientific frame that we still have 12 years, as well as the social justice. Because how is there 12 years left when injustice is ongoing for 500 years of colonial and ecocidal home burning? How can there be time left? And again, once again, maybe time is not our friend. This capitalist time, this linear time is not our big friend. But if our climate activism isn't embedded in the creation of the problem, the history of the problem, how is it going to dismantle it? How is it going to get the right diagnosis? Finally, a protester, again, probably very well-meaning. She looks young, so she probably still has time to learn lots of aspects of political and historical realities. But her board's saying electric cars don't leave scars. And this is this fairy tale that wind turbines and electric cars don't come from colonial mining or rare earth minerals or cobalt or whatnot that is destroying landscapes with child labor. Another example in the Congo right now, where cobalt is mined, under horrific circumstances. The idea of saving the world with a technical fix is ridiculous, and it displaces the systemic harm that people suffer under the so-called green energy as well. So often the white stream environmental discourse is so deceitful and displacing from the experience of the lived oppressions by the majority of the world that it makes people angry. But angry is not welcome in respectable spaces of so-called non-violence. So I added this meme to reflect on why. Why do I have to watch my language for fear of alienating allies when they can watch us die without fear of anything? A closing exercise. Here's a slide with a whole range of people of color who have worked on environment. Some are famous writers, speakers, and have been in the movement for decades. Others are a picture of a movement without known leaders. Others are earth defenders killed for their organizing. And it's a moment to reflect on, who do you know? How do you know them? Where do you see them? Where don't you see them? Is it easy for you to learn from them? And not for personal lack of interest, but is it facilitated? And how much effort do you make? So I'm gonna leave you a moment to look at it. also think about how these people would frame their climate activism, and if climate would be the first word used. So, for instance, for a lot of indigenous earth defenders, um, the words that describe their activism has to do with land, dignity, defending the sacred, or water, health, the fact that their health is literally undermined, um, regeneration. Okay. So it's something to come back to, and maybe also very curious. There are, of course, many people of color in the climate movement that are not on this slide. So also curious in our discussion which people have been an inspiration for you or have taught you something in your journey of climate justice activism. A closing thought: climate justice is decolonial, or it is bullshit. I started this workshop with asserting that climate is a symptom of the problem, and underneath is the persistent crisis that colonialism creates as it plunders the earth and violates the colonized peoples. Today, we may be aware that anti-racism is big and potent, but the reason it is this powerful and rich and courageous is because it is an intergenerational struggle with the wisdom of elders, ancestors, and the courage of the activists today. To heal from colonialism, we also need to connect the dots to center other forms of knowledge. And so I included a picture on the left where we see how Mayan language as a form of knowledge has a particular understanding, a grammar that weaves plant intelligence and human action into the words. And so it is, part of everyday articulation to understand we are part of the bigger family of earthlings. Making our actions or our activism grounded in historical resistance. That's the second point for our decolonial climate activism. Like in Chile last year, we see an example of a fight against privatization and neoliberalism really going hand in hand with decolonial demands and Mapuche reclamation of culture, land, and dignity. So there were 2 million people in struggle last year, causing the climate summit to be moved from Chile to Spain. Very ironic, the historical colonizing nation state. And we see that, in Spain, there were only a few thousands of people able to protest, while in Chile, there was 2 million. And so the idea that decolonizing is too complex to build a mass movement is really a figment of white imagination. It's already happening. The colonial struggle is not more peripheral than the fight against capitalism purely on an economic scale. We need to understand the relationship between colonialism and capitalism, that colonialism backs up capitalism. Without colonialism, there could be no capitalism. And finally, also looking at, like this argument that we can only be massive and big if we keep it simple and we keep it happy is not the reality. Many movements are driven by a combination of despair that creates courage and good relations. So that builds trust, a collective trust. Despair and trust, it's a weird combination that can create magic moments and movements. Here in India, we see just recently 250 million people on strike. And this wasn't a climate action. It was actually a lot of miners or mine employees on the street. But it was 250 million who fought against Modi, who practices a politics of caste discrimination and racism, and was held to account by unions for the horrific impacts of privatizations. So yeah, there are a lot of bank officials, mining employees, 10 unions uniting for protest on a scale that we simply do not know here in Europe. And the unions here have been so appeasing to big power in recent decades. So I think if we would lower our white supremacy, we would learn more from other movements and other organizations. We need to learn from Black Lives Matter. We need to learn from the Indigenous Red Deal, an alternative or a more radical form than the Green New Deal. We need to invest in other ways of being and other ways of knowing. And we need to learn from people of color with a strong anti-oppression political identity. Political identity matters. But positionality and experiences of racism matters too. We need to dismantle white supremacy and human supremacy, as this colonial civilization is a model that has led to mass extinction. Yeah, I think this is my final note for working together to dismantle this project. The closing questions here to ponder are: do you privilege Western knowledge in activism? How much do you know about other forms of knowing? Do you see environmental dimensions in uprisings of the global South? And an invitation also, like, what words do you see that get used? It might be different words than we choose in the NGOs that determine the hashtags here in the West. And sometimes beyond. What environmental authors do you read? And look at the balance. How many are white, urban, and or Western? So yeah, those are the final thoughts to reflect on our own activism and how we've been taught through education and media to reproduce some toxic frames. Thank you so much for your amazing work, your amazing dedication to learning and collaboration and working together. I wish you so much good luck with the endeavor for making this podcast series and everything beyond, because climate justice struggle is a lifelong learning endeavor. And so I'm happy that we were able to reflect on these elements of climate racism, and we will continue to do so and look forward to the Q&A together.